vital that we think about how our work, our truth is helping shape that information, and that is being served to audiences through these tools. So the bottom line is visibility now depends on how effectively your content reaches both people and machines across platforms. Today, we're going to talk, sorry, go ahead, Jen.
I was just going to jump in and see if does it sound better now?
You're
Okay,
good.
great. Yeah, so we'll talk about that through. Are you sharing your? There we. Sorry about that, folks. Let me. How's that? Okay. Yeah. So the way we'll dive into that overview, we'll talk about the user behavior change that we're seeing broadly. We'll learn a little bit about what we mean when we say AI visibility. What are some of the other some of the other terminology and vocabulary out there around this? We'll spend some time on what is actually shaping AI answers. We've done some research about this, and happy to talk more about that. We do have a case study, a real world example, and we've invited Paul Bock from Mercy Corps here to talk about that at his organization. And then we'll end with some great strategies that you all can take and apply in your work. So in terms of who we are, I'm Jenn Johnson, Senior Client Partner at Forum One. I've been with Forum One over 14 years, working with our amazing partners, mission-driven organizations on digital transformation solutions, and just have been really eager to understand how emerging tech, especially now AI, is influencing their digital strategies and approaches. I have my colleague, Sarah Carroll, our Director of Marketing and Communications at Forum One. She'll be leading a majority of the conversation, digging into the research that she's been doing and some of the client work she's done. And then I'll conduct an interview with our partner, Paul Bock from Mercy Corps, and we can talk a little bit more during that section about Mercy Corps and what they do. Sarah.
Awesome. So I think if you're here, you have likely have some awareness of what is happening in user behavior and how it's changing, but I want to put some numbers to that for you all and level set how much that change is actually being experienced. We know from research from Pew Research Center that when users are encountered with an AI summary, so like an AI overview from Google, they went on to click traditional search results just 8% of the time. And that becomes even more acute when users encounter an AI summary, they click on the links inside the summary only 1% of the time. These are significant drops from a year or so ago when we were seeing more like 30, 40% click-through rate. And this has led to really big drops in organic traffic. We've seen sites see as much as 30 to 50% drop in traffic. And industry-wide, we're seeing reports anywhere from 18 to 64%. And this is because audiences are using AI tools. We've seen significant adoption of systems such as ChatGPT. There's a doubling in the past 6 months of weekly usage of some of these tools. And this is particularly among young people. Almost 60% of 18 to 24-year-olds have used generative AI in the last week. And we know all this usage is starting to change how people are actually learning and making decisions. AI is really driving discovery and knowledge. AI audiences are really finding organizations and information. Gen AI traffic to US retail sites on Prime Day, this last Prime Day, increased by 3,300% year over year, which is just so significant. So it's really informing purchasing decisions and decision making. Over 70% of Gen Z already prefers using AI assistants for research instead of scrolling through search results. And even audiences who maybe don't want to use AI are. 61% of Google searches now have AI answers. And so we're getting those summaries as a part of traditional search as well. And so all of this change in behavior leads us to talk about AI visibility today. we know we work exclusively with mission-driven organizations, and we know for mission-driven organizations, decisions about AI, there are a lot of risks and considerations and ethical considerations that have to be a part of any implementation. But I want to be specific and say that while we certainly can have those conversations, today we're not necessarily talking about the adoption of a new technology, but about the change in behavior of our audiences, that technology really being adopted by the audiences we want to reach, and so really becoming more of a channel for our audiences. And in that, I do think as mission-driven organizations, there is a little bit of a call to action. Um, right now, there is a lot of garbage on the internet. Um, and that leads to some garbage answers. And we know you care about the information on the internet, as so many of you are digital communicators or digital people with missions to accomplish. And so we think really that call to action is that you want to be a part of the good information to lead to better information. We know that so many of you have great data and information and should be a part of informing kind of better answers for people to be informed on issues, to learn how to advocate, to figure out the best ways to make our world a better place. So AI visibility has a lot of names. This is a very emergent issue. And so lots of folks are calling it lots of different things. Generative engine optimization, AI discoverability, answer engine optimization, AI optimization, AI engine optimization. For our purposes, we're going to call it AI visibility. We talk about this visibility a little bit more holistically. And so that is what we'll call it here. um, and what we mean by that is where and how an organization or issue shows up in AI answers. And we think that that can really determine both your brand visibility and your ability to influence on issues. Right now, we're measuring that by the mentions of an organization or a brand or an issue within an answer, or links back or citations, references or citations to kind of own content or research or data or thought leadership. Um, or also endorsements or mentions of programs, tools, and again, kind of brand recognition within answers. I know a lot of folks coming to this will come to it from kind of a search engine optimization perspective. So want to put AI visibility in that context. When we're talking about AI visibility, instead of keywords, we're really talking about questions. You're not winning on a specific keyword, you're kind of winning on a prompt. Um, we know with search engine optimization, there's an entirely different user journey in which people can explore and investigate, choose. In AI visibility, it's about kind of receiving summary and continuing to query. With search engine optimization, we're really talking about kind of a website or owned properties. With AI visibility, we're talking about a digital ecosystem. We'll talk a little bit about how we've learned about the way that AI is developing its answers, but we do know that it's looking holistically across the internet and not just on specific sites. With SEO, there's also a little bit of an advantage of many years of some tools being developed. There are opportunities for ads to win via paying and for measurement. Google has its own proprietary tools in which you can understand how people are querying and build a strategy based on some of the knowledge you can gain from some of those measurement tools. There's not really a standard measurement with AI visibility, but we are working on that. And there's currently not a way to pay into an answer, though a lot of people assume that that will be coming. So how are AI answers shaped? We know that AI answers are shaped by what it can read, trust, and reuse. So AI models are really synthesizing from thousands of different data points. AI bots are favoring kind of really context-rich ecosystems. having a presence across multiple touch points, and whether or not that's websites or a news article, scholarly articles, social media, really kind of strengthens the way that AI understands a message or a point or an organization. Um, Content has to be structured so it's really machine readable. We as humans love a beautifully designed site. The robots don't really care so much about our beautiful sites, but care more about kind of the speed and structured data over kind of interactive features. And we also know that authority is now kind of the dominant factor. We know that AI models are really designed to find and amplify the most authoritative sources. We at Forum One, much of the research that has been done on how AI are shaping answers is really in the commercial sector. And because so many of our clients and partners are in the impact space, we wanted to understand how it was shaping answers about issues. And so we started to do some proprietary research about prompts on climate. We had about 100 of the top prompts on climate. Some of them were about issue specific, some of them were just what is climate change. And we analyzed over 30,000 AI generated responses to understand the organizations named and the sources that were cited. As you can see here, the sources are really all over the place. There's some academic, there's a ton of government, plenty of multilateral, so things like the UN, news and reference. There's a lot that is user-generated content, so Wikipedia is a big source, YouTube is a big source. And you'll see many of these points are kind of reiterated that I was making before about authority. And so what do I mean by authority? Uh, by authority, I really mean something that is trusted, accurate, reliable source. This is something we talk about with SEO too as part of EEAT. And how AI picks up on that trust and accuracy in a few ways. It automatically gives it to sites with government domains. So .gov automatically gets more authority. There is definitely authority in democracy. So Wikipedia, Reddit, YouTube are often top citations because of that user and broad acceptance of an idea or message. Traditional news, especially those outlets that have a proprietary partnership with LLMs, are often top citations, which has kind of, in theory, journalistic integrity provides that authority. But we also know authority can be fragmented. There's a lot of authority in the NGO space, but in our research about climate, we found that NGOs appear only 20% of answers. But those are spread across 2,500 domains. And so no one NGO is claiming authority in the same kind of way that government or another source was. And now I'll pass it back to Jen.
Thanks, Sarah. My audio still good, everyone? Sounds great. So let's zoom in on this and get specific with a real world example. Paul Bock has joined us from organization Mercy Corps. Mercy Corps is based in Portland, Oregon, and they're a team of global humanitarians working together on the front lines of today's biggest crises to create a future of possibility where everyone can prosper. They operate in more than 35 countries and have nearly 4,300 team members that work side by side with people living through poverty, disaster, violent conflict, and the acute impacts of climate change. Forum One is really proud to have partnered with Mercy Corps for over a decade on technical support of their website, analytics, and that includes some very fun conversations that I get to have on a monthly basis with our guest, Paul Bock, their Director of Digital Development, which sits within their marketing team. Paul and I routinely chat about marketing trends, web development advances, insights from research that we read, share with each other. And I recall one particular meeting in early 2023, which maybe you all had similar conversations around then, where we screen shared and started looking at exactly what was this chat GPT thing and shared some of our amazement and maybe even a little bit of alarm about what this new future would potentially bring. So Paul, welcome. Can you start by telling us your story and of your journey of awareness through all of this?
Yeah, thank you, Jen. Appreciate the introduction. Really, my journey through this did start with our conversations. Speaking with you over the last couple of years, speaking with colleagues, those with growing interest, those with little interest or understanding of AI, and then, like many of us on this webinar. Blog articles, reading blog articles, understanding that this is going to impact, my professional life. It's also impacting my personal life. I'm a user of AI. News reports. I mean, we're all inundated with, how important or how groundbreaking, or how scary or how this and how that AI might be. And I don't know about the rest of you, but offers in my inbox for solicitations for help and support, those have grown and are generally AI related nowadays. And also, I think what ultimately really drove me to digging in was this anxious and enthusiastic energy within our organization. Questions like, are bots coming? Are they even, are they coming to our website? How do we show up in AI? Well, I've now been able to answer the question, yes, they are coming. And how do we show up in AI? Well, that's still, for me, hard to tell. And so it did take a lot of digging into the data. We don't have a big team, so that was me doing a lot of digging into the data, at a Google Analytics level, noticing that the grounds of the marketing grounds and the audience engagement on our website grounds are shifting. Some are, we're seeing some trends up, some trends down. A lot of those are in alignment with what you've already reported on in terms of sector-wide impact. And so at this point, I'm just trying to make a meaning of all of that data, of all of that input, and also trying to find out, are there different measurements we need to think about? Do we need to think about business strategies differently now, knowing that AI is here to stay and it's growing dramatically? Sarah mentioned her elderly mother. My elderly father, 81-year-old guy, spends a big part of the day interacting with ChatGPT, which is both interesting and a little scary for me, from my perspective. So that's where I'm at right now. Baselining data, setting new goals, learning how to meet audiences in this new and different places. And ultimately, for an organizational level, I've taken the role of trying to demystify what does the impact of AI mean for the marketing within our organization.
Fantastic. Thanks, Paul. And really excited and grateful for you to come and share, the ways you've been demystifying that with our audiences and help do that for them. Paul, you mentioned some of those trends. Some numbers looking down, some numbers looking up. We've got a slide here with some of the metrics, that baseline data you've been collecting. Thanks for sharing this with us and kind of pulling the curtain back a little bit. I know this is your organizational data, so it's really valuable to have you share this with our audiences today. Can you just kind of give us a voiceover of this and tell us the meaning that you are making from looking at this information in this way?
Yeah, certainly. So on the left-hand side, you see bot traffic and referrals, and looking at we started at really ground zero. We started at the server level, and there's reasons for that. But initially, we just wanted to answer the question: are bots coming to our website? And so to do that, we went to the server level and used a platform that we've got our website instrumented with to be able to identify the transactions and the bots that we're seeing, on a daily, hourly basis. We've been able to see at any given time, on any given day, we have at least 4 times more bots on our website than we do people, which is an indicator of, yep, there's a lot of activity at the server level that we don't really see in tools like Google Analytics. We filtered down a little bit more and looked at just those top quote unquote bots, the ones that we're aware of by name, that have front ends that we all engage with, ChatGPT, Perplexity, Gemini, Claude, those sorts of front ends. We saw in between July 1st and September 30th of this year, we did see well over 50,000 sessions, and again, millions of transactions on thousands of different bot visits. But over 50,000 sessions alone. And we're still honing in on being able to get session level data, to be able to understand a bit more, again, at the server level. We took it as a step further and thought about the front end of the website and the traffic that those platforms might be delivering to our website, those folks that were using ChatGPT and then clicking through a source link. This is still very, very modest for us. This source traffic is very modest. It does not make up the loss of organic search traffic, but we now can quantify how many people click on source links from an AI answer onto our website. Again, very modest, but we have found that in the first quarter of this fiscal year, which again is July 1 through September 30th, that ChatGPT is actually our second highest overall contributing referral source to our website. A year ago, that would never have been the case. You would have seen your more traditional referral sources, the earned medias, the JobVites of the world. But now ChatGPT is contributing the second most referral traffic. And I've actually just taken it a step further and been able to attribute some donations to that traffic, which is, I feel like we're really coming along in terms of understanding the impact and the user engagement on our site. Moving over to the right side of the screen, we have the year-over-year comparison, and this is where a lot of us are, reading horror stories about the drop in traffic because of AI, and we, in fact, at Mercy Corps saw this happen. So from July 1 through September 30th of 2025, compared to the same time period in 2024. We did see our impressions increase dramatically, 42% increase in impressions, which a lot of people are seeing, as I understand it. We did see clicks drop from those search results, 32% drop. And then, a lot of the hand-wringing that I'm hearing and seeing and having done my own, done myself, is we saw a 37% drop in organic search to our website. So that can be scary. That is, we luckily don't rely on display advertising, so it's not as scary, but organic search has always been, really a major source, well over 30%, 40%, sometimes eclipsing 50% of our website's traffic. And so when you lose all that traffic, you start to worry, oh no, what's happening? What are we doing wrong? What can we do differently? I dug in a bit more though, and really came to understand that organic search traffic really was never a big contributor in terms of, from a marketing perspective, of conversions. Whether that be an email sign up on our website, or the gold standard of a donation, or a petition signature on our website. Organic search traffic, they were answering questions that they had about what was going on in Syria or what was happening in Yemen. They would come to our site after they clicked a blue link, and they would get that answer and move on. However, the positive side of this that I have found is that the organic search traffic that we are getting today, while we've seen the total donations drop 4%, which is a drop, but nowhere near that's in line with that 37% drop in sessions you saw. Positively, we're actually seeing a conversion rate increase, meaning the organic search traffic that is coming to our site is donating at a much faster clip than the total audience was the same time last year. And we're actually seeing an increase in revenue from that same traffic type. At the end of the day, I sort of am calling this like good organic search traffic. It's the folks with high intent that that really wanted to come to the site, whether it was brand recognition or further curiosity. They would end up on the site from search. So that's an explanation into these numbers, Jen.
Yeah, thanks. And folks in the chat, you can start to add questions if you have them. Paul, really, it's been fun to also kind of watch, your curiosity over the course of our conversations, and digging into the learning and kind of in a sophisticated way, coming up with some analysis, like you said, making meaning, and watch the evolution of really kind of digging into what's actually important in terms of the things that you're measuring, and how might that be shifting if you are seeing a change in your audience funnel. If the pipeline or audience funnel, what did come from organic search previously, if that's going down, what are the ways in which audiences might be finding you going forward? So given that, could you share a little bit more with our guests here today about some of the ways that you've been thinking about taking action as a result of seeing this? How are you responding to organizationally and with your marketing and your digital presence to this new?
Yeah, definitely. And to be clear, I don't lead the marketing effort here at Mercy Corps. My team is within the marketing organization and definitely support the marketing efforts. But this is definitely becoming a storyline that feeds into into our marketing strategy for sure. I think the first thing that I did is understand that I don't know all this. And when am I going to have to partner with people like Forum One? We've alluded to, Jen, you and I have been talking about this for quite some time now. When is it the right time for me to actually dig in and read and learn, and take some time for professional development, and so to get to those answers and to make time to do that, I actually integrated zero-click understanding, AEO, AI visibility, whatever you want to call it, into my own personal professional goals and my team's professional goals. Really allowing and carving out this idea, making it explicit idea enough to have time in our year to get better at it, to get smarter at it, to spend time at it, perhaps even to resource towards it, to allocate budget for it, and so really choosing to make it a distinct goal to pursue a resolution or solution to was important to kick this off and to get people to rally around it. And as the last slide showed, we're baselining new metrics, for AI and the impact of it. We're also at that point, in terms of metrics too, we're trying to understand what are the new metrics we don't know yet that will become important. What are platforms out there? I'm quite familiar with Google Analytics. Are there other platforms I need to worry about, or learn about, or buy, a seat license for? And so those new metrics, I think, are they're becoming clearer, but I certainly do not have all the answers yet. And I do lean on subject matter experts like you all. It's been great getting to chat with Sarah in preparation for this and pick her brain and learn more and more. I think it's also important to run technical and content evaluations of your platforms. We definitely have been doing that here, to understand, traditionally we have a solid understanding of what technically your website needs to do and look like and act and respond. From an SEO perspective, it needs to be mobile first. You need to have metadata. You need to have a clear hierarchy of H1s, H2s, H3s. You need to not, pursue old tactics like keyword stuffing. You need to write clear, honest, language that answers people's questions that you're seeing on search engines. And I think a lot of that's all still true for AEO, for AI visibility. But it does, but we did discover that we had not added schema, as an example, to our website. So we're now pursuing that. It's just more structured data, that complements the metadata that's already there. But it is a It is JSON data that we've not normally had at the template level. And so we're applying that, and that will be an effort to help boost our own website's AI visibility. It's also leading us to content evaluations. Looking at the content itself, because ultimately that's what becomes the answer. That is what people are asking questions about. And so having to reevaluate how we've been writing. Does writing more conversationally, thinking of such things as like FAQs or headlines that are posed in the form of a question versus a statement, that's starting to lean in more towards the AI bot, AI platforms desire to to marry a user's question with an answer. And so we're thinking maybe less writing from an expository perspective and maybe more writing towards a conversational perspective. And again, not to write for the bots, but to write that complements their understanding and that's still interesting for humans to read, because that's ultimately our audience.
Yes. Oh, good.
No, I was just going to say back over to you.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thanks. Really great lessons learned. Good to see the kind of mix of, like I said, sort of strategic organizational priority setting, making sure there's budget, time spent for it, through the technical and tactical into the content strategy. So a really good high level mix of the ways that you're actively learning and acting on these audience changes. And folks, we've got a couple blog posts in here where we kind of dig a little bit more into deeper dive of things like schema and structured data. Sarah's going to talk a little bit about that more in the next section too. And yeah, I know folks are starting to ask questions in the chat about this question of bringing your peers, your stakeholders, your leadership along. Paul, if you could just kind of wrap us up by with your section by talking about how you're communicating all of this to those in your organization.
Yeah, definitely. I mentioned it before, but this started a couple of years ago and still continues to this very day from an anxious perspective. You feel that anxious energy that what are we going to do with this missing traffic? How is AI cannibalizing? Or changing dramatically our marketing funnel, where we're missing our audiences. Where are they going? I guess one of the first things I always tell people is that organic traffic, we're not getting it back. AI is here to stay, and showing up in AI is going to become important, especially now given that AI is making purchases on behalf of people. I now start to think about, okay, if someone asks the question that give me the best humanitarian aid organization to donate to, I want to make sure that Mercy Corps ends up in that, because that person might be able to then donate, using that AI engine, to donate on their behalf. So I think it's okay that organic search traffic is gone. It's challenging us to come up with new and creative ways to show up in this new world that people, in this new interaction people are having with AI. I think it is also definitely highlighting how important earned media, how important user-generated content is. We've always sort of known that. We have a wonderful comms department here that works tirelessly to have our content and have our name and to have our efforts in a CBS News article or a Reuters news article. That's only becoming more and more and more important. And also it's enlightened us to things like, oh boy, Reddit and r/Mercy Corps might be pretty important, something that we never even thought about before. So it's definitely that's where it's helping us to hone in on what our marketing strategies might be in the future. What do we need to change and augment? I think it's just shifting or shifting us into an ability to look at those opportunities, look at them as opportunities, not as fears or from AI, and then how do we react to that? I think one of the biggest questions that I've taken away in the last couple of months, that I think I don't have an answer to yet, and it's actually going to take some leadership thought, and it's going to take some effort afterwards, is and then probably ongoing is, how do we want to show up in AI? Do we want to be an answer, or do we want to be referenced? I don't know if you can do both at the same time. Like I said, we're a small team, and so we might want to pursue one, answer that question and then pursue that, put some concerted effort behind that. And so really, I think, speaking both to leadership and to my peers within the organization has been one of a positive challenge, I think, and something to continue discussing with folks like you.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again, Paul. Stick around for the Q&A. We've got a couple questions coming in. I'm basically, what I'm hearing from you here is, in terms of your measurement strategy changing, maybe if you'd looked at vanity metrics or things like that before, to a degree, you probably also looked at organic search conversions. Importantly, I think newly, I'm hearing you talk about wanting to start tracking AI referrals. Maybe mentions are becoming more important because that proves you're distributed across platforms. And then really looking at the key performance indicators that are actually the most valuable for you, conversions, whether, again, that's lead gen, donations, petition signed, et cetera. So kind of elevating the high impact metrics, and then maybe looking differently about your funnel, your audience funnel, and what are the indicators that audiences are coming from those new places. So thanks for sharing those lessons with us all. We do have a quick poll for you all. We got that popping up here in the middle, and as you all turn your brains on, lean a bit, and think about how your organization is adapting to audiences using AI. You may be where Paul is on his journey. You may be at a different spot. You may be earlier beyond that. We want to kind of start to hear who's here today, and where you all are. As we do that, we'll turn it over to Sarah to talk a little bit more about the how. How can you, what now? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. And try to get through this quickly and address some of the questions as I go here. Paul alluded to some of these buckets, right? Started talking about how he's working in some of these places. I think for us, we're thinking about this in 3 buckets: communications, technology, and measurement. Let's start with communications. There's definitely ways in which we can optimize content based on some of the things we're learning on the way that AI is consuming information and citing information. We know that kind of this use of plain and direct language is really important. AI can be rewarding of full, well-explained answers. We know that we used to have really traditional, like, make it no more than 800 words. And now we're looking at upwards of 1,800, 2,000 words being, kind of this comprehensive answers to prompts. This structural intelligence is really important in content. So kind of organizing content with these clear questions and answers, building content that answers really specific questions, lists, logical sections, really building that structure so that the bots can get to the answers to the prompts that folks are asking. And then there's this developing a strategy to build authority and a consistency, I think, both on and off your website. The good news for those of us that are coming at this as communicators is that a lot of what this requires is just really good communications, right? But AI is really calling us to take a channel agnostic approach by really developing content and content strategies in places both on and off your website. So this could look like developing a Wikipedia strategy, or organizing advocates, donors, or members to share information on Reddit, coordinating with your video folks, with your, figuring out a way to coordinate media and PR teams with digital teams. And I think there was a question in the comments about kind of what is this, how do we have this user-generated content? Should it be on the site or off the site? And really, I think the platforms that exist that kind of create that democratic authority, the Reddits, the YouTubes, are really kind of important to show up in those places and not just within your own domain, or at least that's what we're seeing. We also know that there's technical underpinning here too that can support AI visibility. We know that kind of fast load times, clean code, and accessibility is very good for people. It's also good for AI. And so having those really strong backends to support both humans and bots can be really important. Structuring data, via schema, creating kind of a set of labels you add to code to tell the crawlers exactly what your content is about. Making those labels not visible to users necessarily, but it's critical for machines to understand. And we've seen schema be important in giving indications to bots for search, and the same is true for bots for AI. There's also some ways in which we're starting to experiment to directly communicate with the LLMs. There's a set of tools emerging that allows AI agents to talk to APIs and websites and each other. And this is what we call the agentic web. And there's a few protocols that are coming out, one of which is called NL Web. Another one is called Model Context Protocol. We can happily dig a little bit more into some of these things, but there are opportunities to experiment and figure out the right ways to directly communicate with some of the LLMs in order to really clearly articulate information and inform answers. And then finally, the last piece here is evolving measurement. There are a lot of questions coming in about measurement. I think everyone on this call is now in a place where we realize that traffic is no longer kind of the best metric to understand how you're reaching and moving audiences. And so there is a larger question here, right, of integrating metrics across digital platforms into measurement plan aligned to organizational goals. And a big piece of that is determining the goals and kind of the success, how you track the success along the way. A piece of that is just reorganizing how all of that is tracked together. And of course, there are ways to integrate into kind of this larger measurement plan. We can build certain tracking. As Paul mentioned, he's built some referral pathways into his GA4. That can certainly be a way to track. We have also been using a tool that automates the querying of different LLMs. We know that the answers look different depending on the day and the place. And so there's no one way to say that, in the same way you could say that you were winning a keyword or there's a certain ranking on a keyword. We don't have that same kind of information, but we're building some proxies towards that. We've seen that it's been really it's different across the different LLMs. It's different across geography. And so really, again, honing in on that strategy so that you can build the measurement around it and take the average of queries within a given constraints that your strategy calls for. This is all a lot, but I do think that there are some good questions to get started. Some of these larger strategy questions that we should be asking ourselves. Is brand visibility or issue influence more important to your organization? What does visibility mean to your organization, right? This can help you get to some of that measurement. Then also really figuring out where your content lives beyond your website. As we have been talking about a lot, kind of this ecosystem approach. And then I think one of the questions we think is really important to start asking your organization and yourselves is, what questions should you be the answer for? And what questions should you inform? And starting to build strategies from there. And I think there are some more questions that we can get to.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. We've got about I believe 10 minutes left. Happy to have folks stick around and hop off mute if you, well, I don't know if we could, I think that they have to happen in the chat. But we've got a couple already coming in. I see one early on about, how do we, I believe if I'm interpreting this question right, how do we start tracking AI visibility? We we're learning this as well. There's really great expert organizations out there. Search Engine Land is a really reputable source for a lot of things like this. So I'll just put in for now a blog post from them that it was actually just published yesterday. So I know that it's pretty fresh. Just this one's a little bit more focused on brand visibility, and that may be important for you if, again, to this question of, do you want to be the answer? Is it, what are the best organizations to help with X, Y, or Z, or what are the anyway, if you think you want to get into that, the brand visibility AI search, that might be a way to go about it. But then there's this other question of, are you influencing the topic? So we were talking earlier about Reddit, and there's another good question about Reddit I can dive into. This idea of well, first of all, whenever I bring up Reddit, people are like, the site with all the memes, like that's and it's, yes, but also it's user generated content, it's democratic, they have a very good kind of ranking system, so that building of truth and authority, at least there's good tools in there if we all kind of help shape it. Anyway, there's a great there was a subreddit, R Jamaica, and there was a conversation in there on, what are some of the organizations that I can give to right now to help after Hurricane Melissa. So that might be more of the do you want to be a part of the conversation and answer? But there's also conversations in which your content, your work, your research, your outputs, your work products ought to be influencing the answer. The summary of, we work with City Health Dashboard out of NYU Langone. I think some of them hopefully are here today, and they do aggregate data from public data sources and produce amazing metrics on health at the city and congressional tract level, and they've made it very easy on the website for audiences to understand a particular health metric in their locality. How might that answer get surfaced? So they're not named in that answer, but their work is in the answer. So you might track AI visibility differently in that case.
Yeah, and Jen, just to add, there are a number, again, this is such an emergent area. There are a number of tools right now that will build some metrics as well, that through querying and taking the answers and the results of the answers, and starting to tag via either brand visibility or sources. We've been using one of those tools with clients, but a number of media monitoring companies have added this capability. A number of SEO companies have added this capability also. So we're happy to take some, we can chat offline with anybody who's really interested in what those tools look like, and how we've been using them.
But certainly, if you wanted to start your own research, what this would be a question you could ask and start to kind of dig through the answers. We don't want to put our finger on the scale too much one way or the other, because they're also emerging and new. But certainly new set of tools out there that you can start digging into. There's a question earlier about the success metrics that Paul was using. Paul, I believe we kind of summarized this, but happy to invite you into the Q&A and see if there's anything more you want to say to this. Success metrics you're using now for your website post AI, and how you're reporting those to important audiences, whether it's funders, in your case, donors, maybe you have annual reports, or certainly just your leadership team.
Yeah, we haven't incorporated this information yet into any sort of external reporting, and we're only just now starting on creating dashboards that highlight AI visibility within our marketing organization and the larger kind of resource development organization inside Mercy Corps. And again, we are focusing in on things like conversion rates at the channel level. We've always been interested in, email conversion rate, for example. But now we are definitely monitoring conversion rates at organic traffic for organic search, just out of curiosity to see if we can maintain those positive numbers that I shared earlier. Also, downplaying, page views, sessions from, kind of holistically or from an overall perspective. And so that's kind of some of the angles that we're taking from a metrics standpoint. And I think what I'm not able to do yet today, which is really next on my list of metrics and reporting that I want to be able to do, is I want to be able to, I can see the traffic coming from ChatGPT, for example. I can see ChatGPT crawling my site, but I can not yet, without manually going in and triggering them, I cannot yet go and see where we might be sourced or cited on ChatGPT, and that's the next I guess level and maturity that I want to take personally and professionally from a Mercy Corps perspective.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and I can see Amelia has similar question. I think those the some of those tools that Sarah mentioned are kind of the next frontier for that. And the research that we did for climate has a little bit more of how we went about that with that particular tool. So if you want to find that white paper. Sarah, do you want to pop another question?
Yeah, I think somebody asked kind of how AI engines prioritize owned posts on Reddit, YouTube versus user-generated content. And I think the answer is it depends. I think there is some authority given to user-generated content on specific platforms. And for certain LLMs, such as Gemini or Google's AI overviews, Google also owns YouTube. And so YouTube is a significant source and it uses that source more significantly, whether or not it's owned or somebody else. I think on issues where user-generated content is not as important, we have a large health research organization that we've been doing some monitoring for, and user-generated content is much less of a contributor, much less of a source. Even, YouTube owned was probably mean more than that kind of YouTube generated. So I think it's starting to just, to really get at that, is starting to poke at the issue, or again, the questions you want to be the answer for, or really trying to understand, because it is a bit varied depending on the space that you're trying to show up in.
Which I think leads to a point that we've made in other conversations that I don't think we brought up here, which is it's so important to just embrace a culture of experimentation. Paul has modeled that very well for us here. Here's your curiosity. Where does it take you? What changes do you want to try? Are you measuring the results of those changes? Because we have some assumptions, we have some hypotheses, we've done some testing, and yet it's still so emergent and new. And it's going to change, like Sarah said, from sector to sector, type of org to type of org. And so, dive in, see if to the extent that you can build a, get your authorizing environment to accept some experimentation around this, see what sorts of things you can generate, and then start to track those, which is, what you've always been doing when it comes to great content and watching the analytics, but this is just kind of broadening it one layer out in your digital ecosystem. We do have 1 minute left. Not sure if we, I see a question from Lauren to Paul about end of year giving, the approaches Mercy Corps might be taking to drive donations, if there is anything different you're doing as you think about this big end of year giving cycle. Might be just to reiterate some of the things you've shared, but is there any part of it that you think has elevated that you want to share?
Yeah, Lauren, I wish I could say there was something we're doing differently for this end of year with respects to ChatGPT, AI, and the like. There isn't yet for Mercy Corps. End of year, like all of us on the call, is we raise an incredible amount, a big percentage of our annual revenue from our mass market audiences this time of year. And this time next year, I promised we were going to have some sort of, thoughtful strategy, input for AI. But at this point, it's just still too early on for us. I'm still too new to the game to be able to inform my marketing strategy counterparts.
I think that's really smart. And, it's a counterpoint to what I said about experimentation. And there are still these sort of bread and butter moments that are super important that might not be the time for big experimentation. Depending on your org, that may or may not be true to some degree. So I think that's a great way to end us. And we will wrap it up. There's some materials in the chat for you to grab. We'll be sending the recording as a follow-up. And Sarah, I'm not sure if there's anything else you wanted to say to end us.
No, thank you all for coming, and happy to continue the conversation with folks who are really interested in learning more.
Okay. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.